that the disciples were telling the truth. God raised Jesus from the dead, and that entails that God exists. Finally, my fifth point was the immediate experience of God, and that's yet to be addressed in today's debate. In the absence of any good arguments for atheism, why shouldn't I believe in my immediate experience of God? Why shouldn't? I trust it. Why should I think it's delusory? God is real to me. In the absence of arguments for atheism, why not trust that experience? As for the evidence for atheism, I just want to point out a huge shift of ground on Dr. Slasic's part in the debate tonight. He now admits that the absence of evidence is not positive evidence that God does not exist, but he just says, I don't have a belief that God exists. That, however, is not atheism. Atheism is the view there is no God. What he's describing is mere agnosticism. So even if all my arguments fail, we're still left just with neutral ground, not with any positive reason to believe in atheism or the view that God does not exist, which is what the debate was supposed to be about tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps I'll just go backwards, picking the immediately last remarks that Dr. Craig made. It's interesting he's telling me that I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic. Well, I'm an atheist. And I'm the only kind of atheist you can get. Because if you're an atheist in the sense that you judge your beliefs according to reliable evidence the way science does, I tried to say that there's no better you can do in science. And Dr. Craig suggested I'm an agnostic. Well, again, let me just repeat. I don't think he addressed the distinction I made. I said that being an agnostic, which we often are in other situations, is when we are not sure which way to go. We sit on the fence and suspend judgment when we think the evidence is equal. Then you say, well, I don't know what to believe. But when the evidence is overwhelmingly, or let me put it differently, there is no evidence that looks credible, it's not in the peer-reviewed journals, you're entitled to disbelieve. And atheism can't get better than that. Now, this is just a matter of definition. If we're going to argue about what defines an atheist, well, then perhaps we can agree to disagree on a definition. That's trivial. That's not important. I'm trying to indicate what the substantial basis for rational belief here is, whatever you call it. I'm suggesting you don't get better in terms of skepticism and grounds for disbelief than having no or very little evidence on one side. So that's the kind of atheist which I am. Let me go to the other point that Dr. Craig made. He bases his belief, at least partly, in what he described as his immediate experience. He said, God is real to me. I don't doubt that for a minute. I don't doubt the genuine sentiments, the experiences that people profess. But that doesn't count as the sort of evidence which science and rational belief depends on. I needn't give all sorts of examples how personal experiences can be delusory. They can be caused by all sorts of illegal substances. One can do all sorts of things. And personal experiences get discounted when they conflict with other systematic grounds for belief. So, well, we all know this. This is a common observation. So on its own, I don't have to doubt anybody's personal experiences. This doesn't really cut any ice. As for Jesus, Dr. Craig didn't like my particular story, not surprisingly. But my claim is that I find it inconceivable, in fact, that the only possibility, given historical events that happened 2,000 years ago, about which surely even the pure historical evidence must be open to serious doubt, that you cannot think of more naturalistic explanations besides God's intervention and the miraculous one. I'm simply stuck not being able to accept that there's no alternative given such distant historical cases. Let me try one other topic which we've touched on. The ethical one, and then I'll go back to the onus of proof. In the case of ethics, Dr. Craig keeps insisting there's nothing objective about our moral values unless God is there to somehow guarantee them. Now, of course, he's right. I agree with his premise that if God does not exist, then there's no absolute moral values, because, in a sense, one can define absolute moral values as somehow due to God's commands. But he wants to slide from that, in a sense, by defining absolute as objective. But objective can mean many things besides the claim that God guarantees the reality, as it were, of our moral judgments. And so it's just not fair to insist that the only basis for real moral values is a transcendent being. Excuse me. And the further point that follows from that, which is very important in relation to the morality, if you do believe that, you need to have independent grounds, not based on the moral argument. You have to have independent reasons for believing that God exists. And that's not derived from the ethical argument. So it doesn't stand on its own. And I agree, if God would exist, we might have some transcendent basis for moral values, but you have to have some independent grounds for that. So let me go back then to the question of the rationale and the logic of belief. Let me give an example. Let me try a different tack. I was pleased to hear that Dr. Craig referred to it in passing, but on another occasion expressed skepticism about the possibility that there's intelligent life anywhere else in the universe. The SETI program, and you would have seen perhaps in the film Contact, is an active research program searching for intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. And Dr. Craig makes a very interesting point, which I'm in full agreement with. The physicists are kind of cowboys in this, and they run around thinking that the laws of nature will produce inevitably life and intelligence elsewhere and radio telescopes elsewhere in the universe. And he's rightly skeptical, saying that the biologists, the zoologists know better. The odds against intelligence and radio telescopes somewhere are infinitesimally small. So in other words, Dr. Craig is a skeptic about extraterrestrial intelligence. God is an extraterrestrial, in fact, extra-cosmic intelligence of a certain kind, and it seems to me the reasoning that Dr. Craig applies there is exactly the reasoning which I apply to God. He is skeptical because there's no good evidence, and he's got all sorts of, I think, perfectly good arguments to think that it's not likely. So the question is, why does he have the skepticism and the disbelief about extraterrestrial intelligence and doesn't apply the same reasoning, which is the only one that I think is available in the case of God as well? Thank you.
We have 3 more things to do before we all get on our bikes and go home. And the first, we'll have the concluding statements from the 2 doctors. It's been agreed that at this point in these last 5-minute cases there'll be no new material introduced. It'll be a chance for final rebuttals and to sum up the case. So to conclude his case, I'll invite first Dr. Craig and then Dr. Slezak to speak. Thank you.
Well, I hope that you found the debate tonight as stimulating as I have. I'd like in my final statement to draw together some of the threads of the debate and see if we can come to some conclusions. My first question I posed was, what is the evidence for atheism? And I don't care to quibble about semantics over what is an agnostic or an atheist, but I think it's very evident in tonight's debate that the only argument for atheism has been the absence of evidence for God. But remember, I explained at some length that the lack of evidence for any entity X counts as evidence against X's existence only in the case that if X did exist, then we should expect to see more evidence of X's existence than what we do in fact see. And in God's case, Dr. Slezak would have to meet the challenge of showing that we should have more evidence of God's existence if he existed than all of the evidence that we in fact do have. And he's never tried to carry that burden of proof in tonight's debate. So I think it's very apparent that at least we're left on neutral ground tonight, that we have no good reason to think that God does not exist. Now, what about the evidence that God does exist? First, I argued from the origin of the universe. Dr. Slezak admitted tonight that the universe began to exist, and he disputed the causal premise. I gave 2 reasons, however, to support the causal premise. First, that it's an obvious metaphysical principle. And he said, well, what are the rules of your metaphysics here? Well, look at the 2 sub-arguments I gave for why it's obvious. I said, in the case of the universe, prior to the Big Bang, there's not even the potentiality of its being. But how could something become actual if there's not even the potentiality of its existence? And secondly, I challenged him to explain, if things can pop into being uncaused from nothing, why doesn't anything and everything come into being out of nothing? Why just the universe? I can't see any answer to these questions, and therefore it does seem to me we have good metaphysical grounds for thinking that it's impossible that things just pop into being like universes uncaused out of nothing. But secondly, this is